Hello, my name is Sasha Thomason, and I serve as the Director of the Animal Facilities Inspection Program here at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I appreciate everyone taking time today for this webinar focused on the role of county animal response teams in animal disaster preparedness and response. That is what we will be focusing on for the next 60 minutes, and this is important to KDA license holders for their own awareness and consideration in their own contingency planning. But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. During the presentation portion of the session, all participant microphones will be muted by the meeting host. So if you have a question during the presentation, submit that using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Staff will be monitoring that, and the questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, we will post this, record and post this online on our website early next week. And so now I would like to introduce Keri Korthals of the Butler County Animal Response Team. And Keri, if you would introduce yourself and the role you have with the CART team and the other CART members joining you today, we can get started.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. So my name is Keri Korthals. I am the Director of Emergency Management for Butler County, and we are actually the sponsoring agency for the County Animal Response Team. I've been with the department for 15 years now, a little over 15 years, and have been interacting with our CART team for a good 10 years of that, I would say. With me today is Janelle Jessup, who is the coordinator of our animal response team, and she is also one of the inaugural members who actually helped kick off the team in Butler County. Janelle, anything you want to add?
No, just thanks for being here.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. I will say that our goal today is to give you some insights that are very specific to Kansas. I do know we have some folks that were registered that are outside of the state of Kansas, and hopefully you'll find things that will carry over outside of just how we do things here locally. The whole thing of preparing for animals in disasters and how you respond to a disaster that impacts animals is really, it's not just a Kansas issue, and how we've solved it is not just a Kansas solution. It's something that is a concern nationwide, globally. And we hope you'll come away with some takeaways of the whys of why we do animal planning, and then also some of the hows of strategies that are out there to help address animals in disasters. So what we're going to do today is we're going to back up a little bit, and we're going to talk some of the history of how animal planning came into the spotlight and became a priority and actually became a legal requirement. We're going to discuss specific to Kansas how that legal requirement is being enacted, and then talk about here at our county level how we have used the concept of county animal response teams to meet our planning requirements. So as is the case with most things in disasters and disaster legislation and in disaster planning standards, most of them have their root in a disaster. So normally there's something that's either gone wrong or not perfectly, and we've learned some kind of lesson from that disaster, and that oftentimes will translate into some kind of an update either to guidelines or specifically to legislation and become an actual mandate. And when it comes to animals and responses to animals in disasters, this is absolutely no different. A lot of this was birthed out of disasters, and as is quite frequent, was birthed out of hurricanes. It's not necessarily, though, the hurricane that you would think of. When we talk about animal disasters and animal responses, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind for folks is Hurricane Katrina. And definitely not going to negate how much of an impact Katrina had on animals and animal disaster response. But it is not actually the one that first got the idea of, hey, we need to do something a little more structured and a little more formal when it comes to addressing our four-legged and other type of critters in disasters. The concept of an animal response team or a formal team actually is more than 25 years old. And the hurricane that it really came out of was Hurricane Floyd. So way back in 1999, when this hurricane occurred, there was a devastating amount of animal loss of life. The rough estimates are that anywhere close to 3 million animals perished as a result of this disaster, either directly during the hurricane itself, or a lot of it due to the flooding that occurred subsequently. And after seeing all those kind of deaths, government, specifically initially state government, started to look at, is there a way that we can do this better? We've put so much focus on planning for people and making sure that we've got people accounted for when we're doing evacuations, when we're doing sheltering, when we're doing recovery afterwards. But when it came to the animals, it was kind of like, well, let's just hope it all kind of works out well in the end. And obviously in the case of Floyd, it did not. Now I will, as an aside, let you know that a lot of those 3 million animal deaths were livestock. And what you'll see, the legislation and the standards that we're going to be talking about today are really more geared toward companion animals, so people's pets. But still, that impact to livestock absolutely cannot be discounted. And us in Kansas, being a livestock state, it's definitely something that comes to mind. So like I said, this initially states started looking at, how do we do better? And they started working with industry partners and with ag partners and animal organizations and looking at, is there a way to do some kind of formal response to come up with an actual, say, a deployable team that can address animal disasters? And this eventually over the years started to trickle down to the county level, which is where we're sitting at today. Oh, screen change. So that was Floyd. So that was 1999. While that Floyd definitely brought animals to people's minds and got some of the machine moving, it wasn't what actually eventually launched legislation. So what actually finally made a change from the law perspective was Hurricane Katrina. So yeah, the one that comes to everyone's minds as a really bad animal disaster. That was the next big tipping point when it came to the development of animal response teams. So 2005, Hurricane Katrina was one of those just awful disasters when it came to both people and when it came to animals. So if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of the folks that were survivors of this disaster. Imagine that you're sitting on the roof of your house and the floodwaters are rising all around you and you're just waiting for that rescue boat to arrive, and you see it in the distance and it's coming towards you and the rescuers are on it and you're sitting on your roof with your four-legged family member next to you, and the boat pulls up and the rescuers tell you, all right, climb on in, we're going to save you. Whoa, wait a minute, but the dog's not coming or the cat's not coming. You're going to have to leave them behind. And this caused an extremely heart-wrenching decision for a lot of pet owners to have to make. They were either going to have to be rescued without their pet, be rescued or choose not to be rescued and stay behind with their pet, or as some people reportedly ended up doing, allowed themselves to be rescued, then snuck back in to try to save their pet and had to subsequently be re-rescued. And then also when you're looking at the sheltering situation, people would show up to shelters with their animals in tow and be stopped at the door and told them, you can come in, but your pet can't come in. So again, they're left with that terrible decision of, what do I do? Do I sleep on the street? Do I find someplace else to go because I can't go with my animal? Even more upsetting for a lot of our pet families or pet owners during that disaster was those that did choose to leave animals behind. Many of them assumed that I'll be gone for a very short time. I'll get access back to my home very quickly. So they contained their animals in their homes because they didn't want to have them running free. They didn't want them to get lost, get hurt out, in the debris piles. So they had kept them contained in their home with some foods, with some water, assuming they'd be back to rescue them themselves later. And then instead of being displaced from their home for a night or two, they were displaced for weeks and even longer. And so when someone tried to run the numbers, the best estimates they could come up with was approximately 250,000. So 250,000 animals ended up stranded during this disaster. And an estimated 150,000 animals died. So this was finally that last tipping point where someone said, okay, now we really have got to do better when it comes to our planning for a disaster response. And that brought about in 2006, so the following year after Katrina, what's known as the PETS Act, or the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. Whoever named this act, I got to give them kudos because that was a really clever way to name it. But it is the PETS Act that now says that government has to factor into their emergency planning, not just how do we evacuate, how do we shelter, and how do we care for displaced human survivors, but how do we do that same thing now for our companion animals as well? I will tell you that the law, the interpretation of the law that FEMA has had, it does have a more narrow definition of what is considered a pet that must be planned for. So if someone has a pet boa constrictor or a pet mini crocodile or something more exotic or odd like that, government is not required to figure out what to do with them. It's the more traditional pets like your dogs, your cats, your pocket pets, turtles, that kind of thing. And for those of you who are maybe a little more studied in disaster law, then you may recognize the Stafford Act. That is that big piece of federal legislation that pretty much drives all federal response to disasters. And this PETS Act is actually an amendment to that Stafford Act. So now we've got legislation in place. So we have something that says we have to plan for animals in disasters, which is kind of broad, but that brings us to the actual evolution of planning standards or actual guidelines for government to go by that says in your plans include X, Y, and Z. So looking at it from specifically the state of Kansas perspective, for those that are not familiar with kind of the hierarchy or how emergency management works in Kansas, Kansas statute puts emergency management, that function, at least from a government perspective, at two levels. At the state level, we have the Kansas Division of Emergency Management. They do emergency management for the state. And then at local government level, it is actually the county that is responsible for that emergency planning, emergency response, disaster recovery. All of that is kind of positioned there at the county level, and the county then has responsibility for all jurisdictions beneath it. Also in that statute, it says that the Kansas Division of Emergency Management also dictates what goes in the county's emergency operations plans. So the county, in addition to housing the emergency management agency, has to produce that emergency operations plan, or kind of that playbook of how is the county going to do disasters. And so KDEM, Kansas Division of Emergency Management, has a document called the Kansas Planning Standards that very specifically outlines here's what the counties will cover in their plans. And then every 5 years, those plans are re-upped, and KDEM evaluates the plans against the standards and says, counties, did you do and include what it says in these standards? And that's how basically how our plans are evaluated and approved. In 2006, when that legislation came out and said, now thou shalt plan for animals, Kansas or KDEM did make a change to their planning standards and said, all right, counties, now you got to add animals. And what they did was they asked two specific questions in the standards. They said, how is the county going to handle evacuees that have pets? And how will the county handle pets in shelter operations? So it didn't really ask for any more specifics than that, just kind of generally explain how you're going to do that. Well, then in 2011, they got much more specific in the standards and said, okay, now we don't want to know just kind of generically how you're going to do stuff. Now we'd like you to get down into the details and tell us, how are you going to select shelter sites? How are you going to manage those sites? How are you going to track animals from the point of rescue or presentation to the shelter, all the way through to reunification with the owners. How are you going to provide medical care and emergency medical care to these animals while you have them in your care? So a lot more details had to be added to our plans. And in 2022, they made one additional change and just said, okay, now tell us locally, what agencies are you going to be partnering with to make sure you can pull off all this animal evacuation and animal sheltering stuff that you said you're going to do? And for those who are interested, there was a new version of the Kansas Planning Standards that just came out this year, but it didn't make any more changes to the animal portion of it. So everything stays the same for the moment there. So then looking at locally, how are we meeting those planning requirements in Butler County specifically? What are we doing to make sure that we are performing our obligation toward our animals when it comes to disaster response? Well, I'll tell you, prior to coming up with or having an animal response team as part of our county structure, our earlier versions of our emergency operations plan, when those first planning standards came out, was, well, it met the requirements, but it was a little more vague maybe. In terms of evacuations, our emergency operations plan, when we first started making those changes, still put all the priority on people. Save people, evacuate people. And then kind of as a side note said, oh, and if the people have pets and the pets are properly secured in a carrier, okay, then rescue those too. And then when it came to sheltering, we really just said, well, we'd like to rely on our vets, for example, to talk with their clientele and encourage them to be prepared for a disaster, and have the vets tell the pet owners, have a place to go, have an idea of how you're going to rescue your animal. And if it ends up that we're the ones that are going to have to care for them, then, well, we're going to turn to the Humane Society, and we're going to turn to animal control officers, and we're going to look to the Extension Office. And it was more of, we're going to hope that all these partners will pick up a lot of this for us. And so that was our plan prior to animal response teams. Well, in about 2012, we had some very passionate local folks who decided that there needed to be more in place than just, well, we hope these other organizations will come through for us. And I'm going to turn it over to Janelle right now. And as a founding member of BUCARD, Butler County Animal Response Team, I'm going to have her tell you a little bit about how that whole process came about, the development of the animal response team in its infancy to where we kind of are today.
Back in 2012, I was friends with some registered vet techs with the El Dorado Animal Clinic. And they kind of had tried to start an animal response team a few years earlier and just didn't accomplish it. So they got together with me and several of my friends that were all animal lovers. And we got in touch with Dr. Kristen Scare, who actually was the original person who formed the Kansas State Animal Response Team and Sedgwick County Animal Response Team. She came over and met with us and kind of explained how they got started and how we could get started. And they actually operate as a 501c3. So that was our plan. We were going to get out there and try and get a 501c3 started. But we also knew that we were not going to go out and go rogue. We were doing everything under the authority of emergency management. So we approached emergency management, the director, Jim Schmidt at the time, and Charlene Miller, who was his deputy, and talked with them about it. And they were okay with us starting a team as long as we ran things by them. They were fine with us trying to get our own nonprofit started. Well, we worked on that and set up a board and several directors and met a few times. Jim kind of helped us with some of our training. In fact, Keri gave us our first CPR first aid class, which we refer to affectionately as Keri's CPR boot camp. And we ended up with about 10 regular volunteers that were scattered all over Butler County. And Butler County, being the largest geographical county in the state, meant we have volunteers that may be an hour away from each other. So we would start meeting, and about that time, Charlene Miller decided that since the county had their CERT team, their community emergency response team, that maybe she and Jim could incorporate us into emergency management's volunteer teams, and we would kind of be then under them, under their oversight. And it also would allow us to apply for some grants through emergency management to get equipment. So in January 2013, emergency management gifted us with a spare trailer. It was a equipment trailer that the CERT team had outgrown. And we started getting grants written and working on getting equipment and kind of formally setting up the board and meeting with emergency management and then going out and getting our training. At the time, the state animal response team was doing a lot of training on regional basis. So we were able to get some of the necessary training by going through the state animal response team because they were encouraging county animal response teams at that time. Once we were incorporated into emergency management, it did allow us to pick up a few grants where we acquired some equipment. And when Kansas Animal Health was moved from Topeka to Manhattan, they had a lot of supplies up in the Topeka area that were left from the Greensburg tornado. They contacted the state team and said, hey, do you need these? The state team reached out to Butler and Johnson counties, who were both starting new teams, and said, would you like the equipment? We can't say no to that. So with the help of emergency management's pickups, we actually made 2 trips to Topeka, and you don't even want to see what our trucks looked like coming back. I know we probably weren't legal. We ended up with quite a bit of their equipment, which was stored in my garage because we quickly outgrew the little trailer. We continued along, writing more grants, getting some ASPCA grants to allow us to get some more equipment, and some other grants that allowed us to get training beyond what the state was offering us. We are now fully part of the emergency management team and basically have been since 2013. We became a little more active in 2014. When we first started out, we were doing a lot of public outreach and recruiting of volunteers. There are some strict training standards that the state required, so we adopted those and started getting our volunteers trained to actually be the benefit, along with meeting in regional meetings with other CART teams in the state of Kansas. Crisis City was actually one of those trainings that was through the Kansas Animal Response Team. We did a tent training up there. The Kansas State team has a trailer with 3 20-by-20 tents with generators. So we can go into an area where there is nothing left standing and use tents to set up an animal shelter. And that is a statewide resource that we have available to us that's right now in Sedgwick County.
So that what was going to be a temporary relationship just until you guys could get off the ground and get your 501c3,
We never left.
It became permanent very quickly. And both of us realized that the benefit of having an animal response team fully incorporated into county government and having that resource available to us to meet our planning requirements and to help us with that disaster response was just, it was so beneficial. Not to mention as well, on the flip side, being integrated into county government also gives our team some credibility. It gives us access, gives them access to partnerships with other agencies. And so it became very evident very quickly that this needed to be a permanent relationship. So looking at our current membership, right now, it's definitely not a huge team, but definitely a very effective team with the group that we have. We've got 3 levels essentially of membership in our team, the way it's structured. So we have the folks that are the responders. So those are the ones that do the more intense training. They do the credentialing. They're the ones that are going to do the active setting up and managing of a shelter, doing the animal rescue, the animal handling type of skills. So we've got about 20 of those right now that are either fully credentialed or what we call responders in training. They're working their way through the process. Many of them, what it says is dual members, means that they are also a member of that community emergency response team, or that CERT, if you're familiar with that. Essentially, CERT does the human side of disasters and the CARTs do the animal side of disasters. And as our volunteer cadre has become more and more integrated with each other, we have a lot more members that cross over and do both sides of it, which is kind of nice. It gives us a little more of a force multiplier, a few more people to draw on if we have an animal activation, for example. So beyond the responders, we do also have some folks that either due to limited availability, scheduling wise, or just their circumstance in life, that they aren't necessarily going to want to be animal handlers, but they still want to be involved in the animal response team. Those folks are known as community volunteers. They have the ability to go when a shelter is activated and participate, but in more of an administrative role. They might help with the paperwork, they might help with the intake. They don't handle the animals. They also are there to help with public outreach type of activities as well. So those are our community volunteers. We got about 6 of those. And then we do have a vet clinic we've partnered with that has 3 vet team members that are currently formally affiliated with the team, 2 veterinarians and 1 vet nurse. So what our folks train on now, or what it looks like to credential as a responder, what do you make them do, Janelle?
We continued with the requirements that were set up by the Kansas State Animal Response Team back when we started. They've now changed their training requirements and lessened them a little bit. We're a little tougher on that. Our volunteers are required to take ICS 100 and 700. They must be certified in CPR and first aid. We are also certified in pet CPR and first aid. We do a sheltering training amongst ourselves. We do animal handling training. We also, with our vets, do some training in zoonotic diseases and transmission of zoonotic diseases to help make sure that we're not crossing those boundaries. We do psychological first aid training. We require them to do a psych first aid class every 5 years. Our first aid and CPR are renewed every 2 years. Emergency management requires all of the volunteers who are going to operate emergency management vehicles or at any time pull the trailers. We do go through a driving course with emergency management. Our public outreach is just something we don't really train on. It's kind of on the job. We drop our volunteers in the middle of county festivals and things like that, and they do the outreach talking about disaster preparedness. Our main focus is keeping them safe with the animal handling, the first aid, and knowing how to respond in a disaster. We cross-train with CERT on all of the trainings. CERT volunteers who may not be a dual member are in the animal training just as much as we are in anything that's human related. That way we can be, as Keri said, a force multiplier. If we're not needed for the animal side, then they help, we can help them, and vice versa. Butler County is kind of, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead in your slides. We are kind of known as training junkies. We've gone out and added a lot more training above and beyond what is required. We've received through Code 3 Associates and ASAR Animal Search and Rescue training out of the Kansas City area with Eric Thompson. Code 3 is out of Colorado, and some ASPCA training. Our leadership, our main leadership, also have ICS 300 and 400. We've done that as well for them. We don't make our other volunteers go through the further ICS. We are trained in slack water rescue, swift water rescue, ice rescue, high-low angle rescue, animal decontamination, and we've also gone the extra mile and are trained in large animal response. Through that training and some additional grants, thank you to the SPCA, we were able to acquire a start of some large animal rescue equipment, some rescue glides and some rigging that we needed. This is one of our animal first aid classes. Our registered vet nurse that's on our team certifies us in pet CPR And then she could also certify as an animal first aid, and our vets will jump in and help with that as well. Under the sheltering capabilities, that's one of the things we like to train our volunteers on quickly. We will, throughout the year, we'll usually have a sheltering exercise just on our own that doesn't set up a full shelter, but teaches the volunteers how to set up an animal shelter. This was a full-scale exercise where we were able to use animals, set up a nice full facility, and train them. Sheltering is not just going into a building and popping up some crates. It's very detailed. Some of our volunteers have taken some of the Code 3 and ASAR animal sheltering classes and some ASPCA sheltering classes. When you set up a shelter, you have to go in and make sure that you're not just throwing up a bunch of crates and putting the animals all together. In this shelter, we had basically companion animals. So we set up what are called pods, and there's a dog pod, a cat pod, a bird pod, an exotics pod, and then we'll have like a maternity wing. We'll also have a isolation wing. We'll set up a vet management area, and isolation is usually somewhere near them. There's an intake table where everyone is registered as they come through. The animals are checked in, photographed, matched to their owners. They're tagged. The owners receive a tag that matches, and then they go straight to vet med for clearance. If the vet clears them, then they come out and are placed in one of the pods appropriate to them. But we do set up maternity away from everybody else. And if we end up with cat maternity, we may have cat maternity, dog maternity, just depending on what comes in. We try to protect them from the transmission of any diseases. And this is where the extra training our vets give us in zoonotic diseases really help, so that our volunteers are very well aware of it. When we go in, we will tarp the floors. We will set up the divisions. This is actually showing the dog pod, the cat pod's back on another wall. We try to have some separation. We don't want the cat pod and the dog pod right next to each other. We also don't want the birds right next to the cats and the dogs. So we have to kind of scope out the spaces. In this facility, there were a couple of bunk rooms. So we were able to use one of the bunk rooms as a vet med and isolation. We set up the isolation in the big bathroom that was attached to the bunk room. In this case, we set up our birds back in a corner where nothing was near them, and we're able to set up then our maternity wing in the other bunk room with restrooms. And reptiles, frequently, the only reptile we are really required to take under the FEMA is tortoises or turtles. We don't have to take anything else.
Snakes.
But yeah, we don't have to take snakes, but the exotics and the pocket pets like bunnies, gerbils, things like that, we very easily could have those. And as you can see, there's a sign kind of on the back there that shows cats on the wall. That was our cat pod. That was our intake. It's usually right near a door. And then our reclaim will be near another door. We also set up outside exercise areas for the pets and strict guidance on who is working in which pod.
And in terms of your equipment, you've got it all kind of
We do.
distributed between a couple of different response trailers.
We actually have 2 trailers. Being rolled into the county was the biggest gift we ever got. EMS had a very large comms trailer that they were not using, and they wanted a smaller trailer. So we switched, and we ended up with a huge trailer that has been a blessing to us, and it is filled with the equipment from Greensburg, plus all of the other grants that we've written. And we lovingly, or I call it Moby Dick because it is the great white whale. It is huge, and we leave it at home most of the time. If it rolls out, something's happened. Thanks to it, and then our second trailer that we, through some help from emergency management and a lot of dog wash fundraisers, 4 years worth at least, we were able to purchase a smaller trailer that we now use as our first out sheltering trailer. We also use it when we go out and do public outreach, and our large animal rescue equipment is on that trailer because it's smaller and easier to move. We can take it in initially into a disaster and start the intake procedure and set up. We carry about 10 to 15 crates on it, so we can start the initial steps. And then once we can get that in and start, and we have the 1-ton truck available to us later on, then we can bring the big trailer in. With all of the equipment we've acquired through grants and thanks to the state of Kansas from Kansas Animal Health, we can set up a shelter from anywhere to 100, 150 animals of different types. We don't have equipment for setting up a large animal shelter, but we've gone out and communicated with horse farms in the area and the local feedlot or animal livestock auction in El Dorado, Kansas, where we could actually shelter large animals if we needed to. And we have some resources there. We don't transport large or small animals. That's a liability risk we do not take. We do have teams trained in search and rescue. So we potentially could go out and bring an animal in from an area impacted by disaster if there was an animal running loose. We're not animal control. We do not have any animal control authority, and we do not respond to animal control or animal cruelty issues. That is strictly law enforcement.
And as the law requires this animal sheltering function, what it does not do is it does not force the Red Cross to change their processes. So the Red Cross, you will find that Red Cross shelters for the most part are still just people shelters. What it does is it says that we have to come up with a solution. Now, what are we going to do with those pets? It may be that there's a shelter set up that allows the pets and the owners to be in the same space together. It may be you have a shelter where they're in adjoining facilities, and it may be a situation where the pets are sheltered somewhere completely off-site from where the humans are. But we've been working very closely with the with the American Red Cross here in our area, actually training with them, exercising with them. And we actually just did a full-scale exercise last month. No, now it would have been 2 months ago. In October. Time is flying.
Yeah.
End of October, we did a massive sheltering exercise where the Red Cross activated a human shelter, and then our team activated a pet shelter, and they actually went through the full process of running and actually doing the sheltering of animals and doing the sheltering of humans together. So we're doing a lot of coordination with them to make sure that both of those functions are going to be able to integrate seamlessly in a disaster.
We had when the wildfires last year in Butler County. Yeah, it was, or was it earlier this year? During one of the wildfire batches in Butler County, they had to evacuate a good chunk of the city of El Dorado, and they popped up a small. I think it was 23.
Yep.
They had to pop up a small shelter for the homes that were being evacuated. In that case, we were deployed by emergency management to take our smaller shelter trailer in, and they needed just like 10 crates set up, and we were just going to run in there and set up a small shelter. It was a short term, wasn't expected to be overnight. And so we were just kind of assisting the Red Cross and having some of our staff on hand, some of our volunteers to manage the shelter portion for Red Cross.
Now, Janelle's kind of hinted at the other capability that our team has now. So initially, when this team was developed, it really was focused primarily on sheltering, because that is that core mandate that's coming down through legislation, through our Kansas planning standards. But we are an agricultural county. We are a county that has a lot of large animals in it. And so over the years, they've been building a lot of specialization, getting a lot of training and accumulating equipment to be able to do large animal rescue as well. This is, when I refer to large animal rescue, we're talking about things like animals down on the mud or on the ice, needing some kind of a technical rescue in order to get them either extracted from a situation or uprighted. And we've got a little case study at the end, or a little story that Janelle's going to share about a recent successful animal rescue. But one of the things that is very important by adding this function is we had to build some really good partnerships with our first response agencies, because while we have very highly trained folks now, they've been through a lot of extensive training, they know the proper way to perform these rescues, they aren't going to provide the brawn and the physical act of doing the rescue. they also have a lot of specialized equipment, but not all of the equipment that they need. So we've partnered really closely with our fire departments and with our local rescue squad to be able to integrate and have our folks bring the expertise, bring the specialized stuff, and then use the firefighters as that force, providing the muscle, I guess you could say, to actually do that rescue and to provide some of the extra stuff, whether it's an A-frame to attach rigging to, or our rescue team has a crane we were able to make use of as well. So it's kind of nice too, because it gets our team out there and interacting with our first response partners too. Want to touch a little bit on outreach?
One of the things that Butler County Animal Response Team has done from the very beginning is public outreach. We want to get out in the public and educate them on the importance of having a disaster plan for their pets and their families. We don't say just pets. We provide guidance and handouts on how to do that and how to build a go bag for themselves and a go bag for their pets. So we will go to the different festivals in the city. We speak to school groups, civic groups, senior centers. And over the last 2 years, we've started, instead of manning the barricades at the parades for all these cities, we've started being in the parades. So both the CERT team and the animal response team usually have our 2 trailers, our small trailer, sometimes the big trailer, and their communications trailer, and the emergency management vehicles, which kind of gets the word out about emergency management. And what we've discovered is a lot of people aren't really sure what emergency management does. So it's enabled us to enable the team to share that, to give people another resource, and make sure that they're thinking about planning for them. We even participate in, EMS has a kids camp, a 2-day kids camp every year, and we participate in that. And these are like 6th through 8th graders. And those are so much fun for us to attend. We have the kids that come back year after year, and they come back to tell us that they now have a go bag for their pets, or they went home and had their family prepare a go bag. So we know that we are getting that education out there, and we always try to teach people that preparedness is key to your recovery.
All right. One thing that some of you may be wondering about, especially if you're from a government agency, you probably recognize that there's going to be a commitment. If you're going to be a sponsoring agency like my department, there is going to be a measure of commitment in terms of financial equipment. So we do, since acquiring, I guess you could say, since partnering with the animal response team, one of the commitments that our department has made is to ensure that they're properly funded. As Janelle mentioned, they've done a lot of their own grant writing, a lot of their own fundraising through a variety of methods. ASPCA, Community Foundation grants, dog washes is a great fundraiser. We also put a portion of our emergency management performance grant toward the team. And just within the last year, the county commissioners have also committed a portion of some general fund money as well toward the team. We also make sure that the team members are properly equipped, that everyone has their deployment kits, that their equipment is kept up and in working order. And as part of that commitment as the sponsoring agency, we ensure that if we're going to ask them to credential in something or ask them to be trained in something, that they get the opportunities to actually get these trainings at no cost to team members, and that they get the opportunity to exercise their skills. So there's definitely a lot of buy-in and a lot that we devote as the sponsoring agency to ensure this team stays functional. As a quick side note, before we get, because I know we're kind of starting to get closer on time and we want to make sure there's room for questions. I will tell you that as an asset of the county and as a team of emergency management, our team is activated through emergency management. So someone that needs the assistance of the team does have to go through us. And we are willing to deploy our team outside of the county. So while their primary mission is to support Butler County, we have definitely had them leave the county to support other jurisdictions as well. All you need to do is ask, and we'll assess the situation, see if it's something that we can support, but it's definitely a possibility. So before we get to the questions and answers, I did promise that there was a story. So Janelle's just going to tell you a little bit about a rescue that they actually performed, one of their large animal rescues earlier this year.
This was on a very, very cold January day. And as you know, we had some bitter cold there and a lot of iced over ponds. The Andover Fire Department was paged to a rescue out rural Butler County between Augusta and Andover for a horse that had been down on the ice. She had probably been there since the night. She was seen the day before and then wasn't seen until 11 o'clock the next day. Thankfully, it was a fairly shallow pond. The ice was solid, but in the first picture, you can see the firefighters out there with her and how far offshore she was. Because we are a volunteer team, we don't all stay in the same building. We're not all standing around waiting to deploy. I received the call from emergency management, and then the fire chief was sent to communicate with me. I started rounding up some team members. This was during the day. A lot of our volunteers obviously work full time. So we were able to round up about, I think there were 3 of us that deployed initially to the first day's response. This actually covered multiple days. We got our volunteers here in Augusta. I think we only had one of the volunteers that lived here. The rest of us were from El Dorado. So there was some traveling. Emergency management, God bless them, had our trailer hooked up and ready for us to go. And we were there within probably, I'd say, an hour of being called. Because the horse was out on the ice, she was starting to struggle a little bit. There was some concern she was going to go through the ice. Firemen being firemen were, yeah, let's just grab her and haul her in. Well, you actually can't just grab a horse and pull it in by its neck, which they were starting to do. And I happened to be on the phone with the chief when they started doing it. So we were able to stop that and explain to them how to bring her to shore safely, and work with the chief. Andover Fire is one of the agencies where we hold a dog wash every year at their station. So they are familiar with our volunteers. They've even attended some of our large animal training as members of the rescue squad. So we were able to get her on the ice, off the ice, onto the shore, get her warmed up a little bit with the vet. And then it was determined that where she was at was getting a little muddy and it was not a level ground. So we got her over and got her onto one of our rescue glides. And this was an area where you were not going to get an engine back there. We barely got back there with our small trailer. They had a brush truck back there with a winch. So we were able to use the winch to attach to our rescue glide. Once we had her secured safely on the glide, we then moved her about 250 feet up to a level ground. We got her up on her feet initially with the Becker sling, which was actually something that was donated to our team by a large animal rescue team in California that had a spare Becker rescue sling, and they shipped it to us through some partners of a large animal rescue group in the state of Nevada that has kind of adopted us and helps us with some support and backup. We got her up in the sling. She'd been on the ice too long. She could not bear weight. So we left her out overnight. Her owner brought out hay. He brought out space heaters, electric blankets, a generator, and they kept giving her warm fluids and feeding her and keeping her warm all night. They got her up we got her up. The next day we went back out, got her up. We had to take her and walk her a great distance through a low water creek to the barn, leaving her in the sling because she could not stand alone. Brandy's very dear to us, and I think Keri's got a slide of the success. Yeah, let's get the next one. Brandy delivered a very healthy filly in October of this year. So we are just so pleased that she was touch and go for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
We had some issues with her not being able to stand. She went through some extensive treatment, but she's healthy and she has a beautiful filly.
Yep. Now successfully a mommy.
Yep.
We thought that'd be a nice positive note to end on. There's our contact information. If anybody does want to reach out with more specific questions beyond the question and answer period, anything specific to either managing a team, doing this kind of planning and training. So I think, Sasha, do we turn it over to you for questions?
Actually, I'm
Dana.
going to take it, Keri. So thank you. We have just at 10 minutes left with it. So we have a couple of questions. So if we can just get to the answers, that would be great. The first question came in from Riley, and she said she may have missed it, but what facilities do you use to set up emergency field shelters?
So we can use a variety of, as Janelle mentioned, they're going to basically any space that we do use, they're going to convert. They're going to completely tarp it, protect it, bring in all the equipment from outside. We have a couple of places that are pre-identified, a couple of larger, because we're definitely going to need something that's got a broader space to it. Couple sites pre-identified, some that we're just going to have to, depending on the community impacted, do it just in time. Did you want to talk a bit at all about what you look for in a good location?
We basically look for a large building, such as a community building or maybe fairground facilities that have an enclosed building. We want the animal shelter for the companion pets to be in an enclosed building, preferably with heating and air conditioning. We need restrooms, we need hot and cold running water. It's great if it has a kitchen facility because our volunteers will staff that shelter 24 hours a day. We will not leave the horses, those either, but we won't leave any of the animals alone. We will have staff with them 24 hours a day. Church basements occasionally, our National Armor Guard, any of those kind of armories work, but a lot of it is just in time training and finding a facility in the community that's impacted.
Yeah, we do have a goal of trying to pre-identify a few more with our next round of emergency operations planning, but yeah, some of it'll just be in the moment.
Got it. You've mentioned that you've written a lot of grants. You have friends of that help with some of your supplies with it. Are there supplies that are used more or needed more during an emergency with pets that that you would like to see your team have more of?
We can always, our team specifically is setting pretty good on crates, but we can always use more dog leads, zip ties, buckets. We use a lot of stainless steel buckets, disposable cat litter pans, cat litter. We don't keep animal food of any type on hand because it's just not practical.
Mm-hmm.
We use decon, we use Dawn to decon, good old Dawn dishwashing liquid, but there's also supplies that we need, like any vet clinic would use to sterilize the equipment, because all equipment is sterilized before and after it's used.
And basic first aids.
Basic first aid supplies, pet first aid kits, any vet wrap, things of that nature that we can use, stuff that doesn't expire, hoses. We actually, through one grant, went and bought a water bladder, but a team starting out, it's not a bad idea. I think ours is a 480-gallon bladder that we can use if we're in an area where there isn't water. Fire can fill up the bladder for us and help us. Metal tubs for decon. It's good to have gloves, sterile gloves. We're lucky we're with emergency management, so we can get booties. We have some Tyvek suits as well, N95 masks. One of the things, painter's tape. We go through tons of painter's tape. Material to tarp. We use tarps, plastic sheeting, things like that. Cleaning supplies, tools.
Well, super. I have two questions left and we have just about 5 minutes. And one of the questions was, it relates back, you mentioned having a to-go bag, which a lot of people have them, but what would you suggest to have in a to-go bag for your pet?
Oh, for pet.
For pets, we suggest that they have a minimum of 3 days supply of food and water, but 7 days is better. Obviously, it's a gallon of water per day per pet. You need food, you need dog treats, you need comfort items like their blanket, favorite dog toy, high quality dog treats, their medication, extra leash, extra collars. Tie out chains are really good, because if one of the first things to go is the fence, So a way to get your dogs out and get them tied out. First aid kit for you and your animal is in there. We also recommend that everyone take copies of their pet's vet history, all of their licenses, their injection history, so we know that they've had vaccines, the core vaccines, because otherwise we'll have to vaccinate them when they come into a shelter. And we have a pet information sheet that we hand out where you can list who your vet is, who your emergency contact is, what information we need to know about your pet. If it hates other animals, if it bites, don't touch its food, don't touch its nose, if it's food aggressive or animal aggressive. And then we also suggest you take a picture of you and your pet. Keep all of this information and put it inside a waterproof zip tie bag or Ziploc bag, or you can laminate it and keep that in your kit as well. Any pet insurance information you may have, copies of city licenses, but something to tie the pet back to you, because we are going to need positive identification.
Well, great. I have one last question, and then Sasha, will turn it back to you. You've talked big picture with things and large events, et cetera. Do you ever utilize private boarding facilities or any of that, or do you mainly stay within your SOPs and what you have for an outline and use mainly public spaces?
We definitely would be open to partnerships with private facilities as well. In fact, when our county experienced a tornado a couple of years ago, it ended up not being our team that sheltered the animals from that community, because one of the local hospitals, animal hospitals, actually opened their doors and said, hey, any displaced animals, anyone whose home has been destroyed, you can temporarily house them with us. So that community ended up taking care of itself in terms of the animals. And so if there are folks that are already set up that have facilities in place where we don't have to take everything out of a trailer and start from scratch, we're also definitely open to partnering with folks where the infrastructure is already there. Maybe we just need to provide some people and some specialized expertise.
Well, great. Appreciate your time. Sasha, I'll turn it back to you to finish it up.
Yeah, I just want to extend a huge thank you to the Butler County team. Thank you so much for your time and expertise this afternoon. And yeah, hope everybody had a good time and learned a lot. And thank you for joining. Have a good day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.